Good morning or afternoon. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange team and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Climate, Weather, and Sagebrush Seed Sources, Experimental Insights on Challenges and Opportunities, presented by Matt Germino with the USGS in Boise. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that you may ask questions of the speaker or me at any time during the webinar by typing your questions into the questions pane of your control panel at the top right of your screen. I will keep questions for Matt in the queue and field them after the presentation. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio pane and check your audio selections. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Matt Germino is a research ecologist at the U.S. Geological Survey in Boise, Idaho. His current research includes plant-soil climate relationships and biophysical and physiological ecology from leaf to landscape. He also works on science in support of the Department of Interior Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, works on the ecology of upland and terrestrial landscapes in the western U.S., with emphasis on understanding resistance and resilience of semi-arid plant communities, causes and consequences of vegetation change, invasive plants with emphasis on cheatgrass and exotic forbs in the sagebrush steppe, and fire effects with emphasis on post-fire wind erosion. Welcome, Matt, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Johnny.
All right, I'm making you the presenter now.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Okay, so thanks again. I very much appreciate the opportunity to present, and thanks also to our audience for tuning in. And I'd also like to acknowledge my funding sources before I begin. Most of the research that I'll present today was supported by the Great Basin Native Plant Selection and Increase Project, otherwise known as the Great Basin Native Plant Project, and also the USGS Northwest Climate Science Center, among other sources. And there's many people that have contributed in different ways to the research that I'll present, including Martha Braybeck, Anne-Marie Moramonde, and Bryn Lazarus here in my unit, as well as Bryce Richardson, who's a geneticist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station of the Forest Service. So there's many factors that affect the outcome of restoration or rehabilitation seedings and plantings. And three of the most important ones in the Great Basin are climate of the site that's we're trying to restore, the weather following seeding, and climate adaptation of the seeds that are selected and used in the restoration. The seed transfer zones based on climate are the primary means for dealing with climate adaptation of our restoration plants, and seed transfer is the focus of my presentation today. Seed zone guidelines have long been used in forestry economy and horticulture, but they're actually pretty new in the Great Basin, and we think that their development may be urgently needed considering all the conservation problems with sagebrush and sagebrush ecosystems, and considering all the effort to seed sagebrush that's occurring each year after fires. And as fires increase on the landscape and become large, like these 500,000 plus acre fire patches, seeding is only going to increase in importance. And this is particularly true for fire-intolerant species like big sagebrush. So sagebrush is very important for conservation of sage-grouse and other wildlife, and many people feel that seeding it is necessary because it doesn't resprout after fire, nor does it have a good seed bank. Its seeds have relatively short duration. Usually they're only viable for about 3 years, up to 3 years in the wild. And then furthermore, there's not very good seed dispersal distances from the host plant. Usually the seeds only go a meter or so from the host plant. And small seeds are also vulnerable to disturbances like being buried by sand or soil deposition from erosion and other impacts to the soil surface. So regarding seed zones, they're not very well developed yet for most species in the Great Basin, yet we're transferring seeds large distances, as I'll demonstrate to you. And we need to quickly get a grip on guidelines for informing seed zones. And there's two ways we can do that. One is via common garden experiments, which generally can provide information within 5 to 10 or preferably longer, 5 to 10 years or preferably longer time periods. But an alternative way, a complementary way that we can learn about seed transfer effects is to look back on the very many post-fire seedings that have been done in recent decades and see if we can detect an effect of seed transfer on the success of those seedings. This is challenging to do, and it's something we've been working hard on here at the USGS. All of the data that I'm going to present today are unpublished, but we're trying to get them out into the literature as we speak. In the Great Basin, this research of past historic seedings is challenging because, number one, seeding projects tend to be done over huge areas, and there can be lots of variability within those areas. But secondly, there's fairly sparse resources available to the agencies to monitor the outcomes of the seeding projects, and getting the data or the information on how the seeding was configured is oftentimes challenging, and sometimes it's actually impossible. The data or the information needed to understand the seeding may not even exist. And then lastly, synthesizing the information is no small task in itself. So sagebrush is remarkably diverse, which isn't too surprising given that it's such a widespread species and given that it occupies such a wide range of climates and habitat types. And so I want to introduce to you some of the key elements of the interspecific diversity in big sagebrush. There's, first of all, 3 subspecies that parse into different cytotypes that differ in their clothing number. So 2N refers to a diploid plant. 4N refers to a polyploid or specifically tetraploid plant that's undergone a genome duplication. And at the highest elevations, we have mountain big sagebrush, which can either be diploid or tetraploid. It's subspecies Bassiana, and so I'm going to refer to it in future slides simply as B. I'd like you to try to remember that if possible. And to distinguish that from the letters that we'll use to denote the other subspecies. So these subspecies differ in elevation and topographic position. So on the slopes, the higher elevations, in the cooler, wetter environments, we've got mountain big sagebrush. At lower elevations, like on the flat Snake River Plain, we have Wyoming big sagebrush. It's always tetraploid. Its landscapes are where we are seeing the most problems with invasive annual grasses and increases in fire. And this is also the ecological site type that tends to be receiving the most post-fire seeding effort. Also at low elevations is basin big sagebrush, or subspecies tridentata, T. It can be either diploid or tetraploid. And this subspecies tends to be relatively large in terms of its traits. It has characteristically long leaves, often a single trunk at the base versus the branching at the base of these other subspecies. These subspecies also tend to differ in their crown forms, and they also differ in their UV reflectance, which happens to relate to leaf compounds that also affect palatability. Mountain big sagebrush, which is highly palatable, has high UV reflectance, whereas basin big sagebrush tends to have lowest or no UV reflectance, and that is related to its lack of palatability to sage grouse and other wildlife. These subspecies also differ a lot in seed, in their seed size. And Bryce Richardson has some new research that is just coming out now that describes how seed size differs so strongly between these species you can actually use that as a diagnostic feature, a trait to identify which subspecies you're looking at. Basin big sagebrush produces lots of seeds, and it also tends to occur in the margins alongside roads where soils can be deeper and more, well drained. Mountain big sagebrush at the higher elevations tends to occur in areas that are more reliably wet, and it tends to have more reliable seed production from year to year. And both these contrast Wyoming big sagebrush, which tends to grow in the drier areas and has many years where no or few seeds are produced. And as you might imagine, a common problem may be that seed buyers or purchasers are requesting Wyoming big sagebrush, but there might be a tendency to fold in basin or sometimes mountain big sagebrush seed into Wyomingensis seed lots. One of the key ways that we're learning about differences in climate adaptation amongst these subspecies and populations within them is by using common gardenings, such as this one shown here in the photo from Orchard near Boise, Idaho. Bryce Richardson established 3 of these gardens. He collected seed sources from all the subspecies throughout the entire western U.S. almost, and planted about 10 to 12 individuals of many populations of each subspecies in these very large gardens that started with something like 400 or 500 plants per garden. And we've been monitoring these with Bryce over the last few years. And some of the key things that we've found help us understand the differences in climate adaptation both among the different subspecies, shown here on the right, as well as within them. So let me explain this graph, which looks kind of complex, but there's actually a pretty simple message that I'd like you to take home from this. The x-axis shows a measure of photosynthetic water use efficiency. And we can determine this by measuring the carbon isotopes of the plants. On the right axis, again, we've got the different subspecies, so basin big sagebrush, the diploid, as well as tetraploid forms in different colors. And then Wyoming big sagebrush in gray, tetraploid mountain big sagebrush in blue, and diploid mountain big sagebrush in the open bars here. And then on this axis, we're showing the different populations, like the different seed lots within each subspecies type. And what you can see from this graph, for water use efficiency, which should be an important trait considering that we've got a species growing in a semi-arid area where water is limiting, you can see that the variability in physiological water use within a population, like within these green bars for diploid basin big sagebrush, is huge compared to the mean differences that you might be able to envision amongst the different subspecies types. This is important because it's an example of how population variability can be really important in big sagebrush. And by extension, we might expect that there could be local adaptation in big sagebrush that could be important to try to deal with in selecting seed sources. For other traits, by the way, we've seen that there's large variability amongst the subspecies, such as in like cold response. So that's a little background on big sagebrush. Now what I'd like to do is show you what we've learned from a pilot project in which we've looked back on 20 years of historic seeding within the Eco region, specifically the Snake River Plain. And we had the following objectives. We wanted to learn what is the effect of transferring seed from one climate to another in post-fire sagebrush seeding success. And along the way, we wanted to ask what's the effect of the climate of the site. You might expect colder and wetter sites to have more success, given that we're dealing with arid landscapes. We also wanted to know how the climate of the seed source independently affected things, as well as post-fire seeding weather. Obviously, moisture is important for seeding success, and many other factors such as the density and abundance of pure live seed per acre, or how the seed was put on the landscape, whether it was dropped on snow, whether there was rangeland drill seeding of grasses that accompanied like an aerial drop of sagebrush seed onto the site. And then lastly, what's the ecological condition of the site, and how does that affect success in light of all these other variables? In our view, it's important to consider the full gamut of all the variables affecting sagebrush seeded success in order to begin to detect the effects of seed climate transfer. So on the right here is a map showing the polygons of some of the different areas that we sampled in the Snake River Plain. To find sites, we screened the land treatment digital library and found all those treatments that had some sort of seed source information. We found that we needed additional information that could only be provided by the field office that did the seedings. And we were very fortunate that Cindy Fritz of the Boise BLM district had been very careful in recording most of the information needed to get a robust assessment of what happened on these post-fire seedings. We did look throughout the entire northern Great Basin, and the information available for southern Idaho just wasn't paralleled in the other districts. The seedings occurred from 1987 up to 2010. All of them were aerial seedings, and we filtered out any of those seedings that had reburned after the seedings had occurred. Obviously, that would eliminate sagebrush and affect the apparent sagebrush seeding success. And last year, we spent a lot of time sampling these areas using an objective strategy at both the plot and the landscape level. So we did very large transects looking for sagebrush of a variety of age and height classes. And then on top of that, we used Google Earth, and we trained the accuracy of Google Earth for looking at big sagebrush abundance. And we were able to look across the entire treatment area to see whether or not we were capturing all of the sagebrush that could have emerged. And that technique worked out surprisingly well. And we spent most of our time actually trying to identify the sagebrush present using some of the characteristics that I described to you before. And before I get too much further into showing you the results of this work, I want to emphasize that there's a number of non-trivial complications to doing this research. Foremost is the availability of treatment information, like what types of seeds went into the mix, a variety of conditions that could vary from one treatment to the next in terms of implementation that affect outcomes. Many treatments used multiple seed sources, and this is problematic because we needed to be able to compare seed origin to seeding site. There's uncertainty in where those different seed sources were put within a given seeding treatment. There's also a lot of unfortunate uncertainty in where seed was collected. And usually what we're given is the elevation and county reported by the seed collector to the seeds certifier. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to come by GPS points. And apparently, part of the information gap is linked to the fact that seed collection sites are supposedly proprietary or something. Anyways, that's an unfortunate bottleneck to being able to do the types of analyses that I'm going to present to you today, which I also feel are a key part of our ability to have adaptation to shifting climate in our land management. Another major problem is we can't know the taxonomic identity of seed where seedings failed outright, and there was no sagebrush left on the landscape to sample. In spite of all those factors, we still learned some important things. So, fortunately for us, there was a wide range in seeding success across these 24 treatments. And that's what we needed in order to do our analysis. 9 of the treatments had absolutely no sagebrush on the landscape, and we did double check in many ways. 16 of the treatments, however, had at least some sagebrush, and 5 of them had fairly high abundances of sagebrush within 5 to 10 or more years after seeding. So, for example, some of these sites right here, you could picture about something like 1 sagebrush plant at least per 8 meters squared in terms of density. Most of the sagebrush populations appeared to be relatively stable with a greater abundance of adults compared to younger size classes. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the x-axis here is is different height classes of sagebrush, and the y-axis is abundance of sagebrush. Some of our populations looked to have a higher abundance of young plants. Those young plants were really abundant, and we could anticipate that this particular site, for example, will only experience more sagebrush and more presence of sagebrush in future years. Now, some important patterns. First, just looking from the records of each treatment, we saw that seeds were transported long distances. So the left axis here shows the abundance of sagebrush resulting on these projects as a function of the distance, the mean distance that seeds were transferred to the site. On average, seeds were transported about 300 miles, oftentimes from central Utah up to the Snake River Plain. And then the right panel here shows that the seeds were furthermore brought from higher elevation down to lower elevation. This shows, again, abundance of sagebrush on the y-axis, and then x-axis is the difference in elevation between the seeded site and the seed source. So a negative value means that the seed source site is higher in elevation. On average, the seed source was about 700 meters, which is about 2,200 feet elevation higher. The seeds were generally coming from higher elevation and cooler and wetter locations, and being brought to the warmer, drier Snake River Plain. We learned some interesting things from the identity of sagebrush on the seeding sites. This graph, or this table rather, shows on the left the different treatments that had sagebrush, the abundance of sagebrush on those sites in decreasing order. The third column shows the subspecies that is deemed to be native to those sites according to NRCS ecological site descriptions and from the agency records that we read. And unsurprisingly, most of these sites were deemed to be Wyoming big sagebrush sites with some higher elevation mountain big sagebrush intermixed. The next column over shows the sagebrush subspecies type that the BLM requested and thought that they were buying. And typically it was Wyoming big sagebrush. Sometimes, however, though, they knowingly were perhaps taking whatever kind of sagebrush they could get given the situation. Keep in mind that in many years it may be difficult to get sagebrush seed for a variety of reasons. Now the last column on the right is the most interesting. This is the taxonomic identity of the subspecies we encountered on the seeding sites. W again is Wyoming, T is basin or tridentata, and B is Vasayana. This Vasayana times tridentata is a hybrid, showing traits equally in support of these plants being mountain as well as basin big sagebrush. Other hybrids are shown with parentheses like this. This would mean that the subspecies was more strongly a basin big sagebrush subspecies with some traits of Wyomingensis, and then the numbers refer to the number of plants in each category. And what you can see is that often there are different types of sagebrush planted on the sites or seeded on the sites other than what is considered to be native or what BLM thought they were buying from the seed vendors. And then furthermore, hybrids are being introduced. Keep in mind these seeding sites are on the vast Snake River Plain, where landscapes tend to be flat, and where we know that Wyoming big sagebrush tends to be dominant. The seed collection sites oftentimes were from central Utah, where you have a lot more topographic features, and specifically canyons and elevation gradients. In those kinds of landscapes, you would expect there to be more hybrids between the different subspecies. And so it's interesting that we've brought in, not only have we brought in what you might consider to be exotic subspecies on the sites, we've introduced hybrids. Those hybrids and different subspecies are probably exerting influences on the landscape now, but as they begin to hybridize with the surrounding native species, there's also some interesting patterns that we might expect. In spite of all these different subspecies being introduced to the sites, I could not find any effect of subspecies identity on the success of the sagebrush seedings. Instead, we saw lots of indication that population level variability within subspecies might be more important. So now I'm going to talk, and the way that we can get at that is by looking at the climate transfer effects. And I want to talk very briefly about how I dealt with modeling the climate of seed sources, seed sites, and how we represented the weather after these seedings. So you can picture our study matrix being a bunch of polygons in GIS, and you want to know across that whole polygon, sometimes maybe 10,000 acres, what was the weather following the seeding that could have influenced the sagebrush. Similarly, we want to know the long-term climate traits of that seeding site, and we wanted to know the climate of the areas where that sagebrush seed could have been collected from. Now, let me start with that latter problem. So what we're given again is the elevation and the county from which the seeds were collected. Some of these counties are large. So we had to guesstimate where the seed could have come from. To do that, we overlaid the gap map, or the landfire map of sagebrush, and then furthermore overlaid like roads to identify the polygons where we think sagebrush could have been collected from. And then we selected points within that polygon, a number of them, to generate an average climate of the seed source site. And we used PRISM data to get that long-term climate, 30-year climate. We did this for the seeding area. It was pretty easy. We just took the entire polygon of the seeding treatment and used PRISM again to get the long-term climate. And climate parameters we chose were carefully selected to represent the different stresses. This, by the way, is a climate diagram showing by month the monthly average temperature in the dotted lines. The solid lines show precipitation by month. And two important things are learned from this graph that are key for understanding the climate of sagebrush ecosystems. So sagebrush is largely growing during midsummer when there's a net deficit of water. In other words, water is being lost from the ecosystem. And as many of you know, sagebrush tends to be relatively deep-rooted, and it can grow during this summer, dry summer period, primarily by using the winter precipitation, which has come in a period when it's cool and water can infiltrate deep into the soils and be stored for use in the summertime. So we used traits like minimum winter temperature. We used metrics of the summer water deficit, growing degree days, and things like that to characterize the climate. For weather, we took a different approach. We thought of what it would take to get a seed to germinate in the spring in terms of available moisture, for it to not be killed by a frost or something. So we looked at minimum temperature during these months. For it to survive summer drought, which is a function of whether or not growing degrees were appropriate for it to get its root deep enough to access winter moisture, and the strength of the summer water deficit. And then for that seedling to survive the first winter, which is a function of minimum temperatures, so on and so forth. So we basically created a series of variables that would essentially grow the plant. And this helped us deal with situations like in 2013, dry spring, really erratic. There's no way, very difficult for sagebrush to establish in this sort of year. So we were able to capture this kind of variability. Now here's what we learned. I'm going to go through the details of this graph because I'm going to repeat the format of it for other variables. On the top, I'm showing mean annual precipitation, then annual drought index, mean annual temperature, warm growing degrees, so warm growing degree days, so in other words, number of days warmer than 5 Celsius, cold accumulation days, so freezing days. A larger value means more cold accumulation, more cold exposure. And then the bottom panel is the mean temperature of the coldest month, in other words, severity of winter temperatures. So the left bars show the, in this case, climate for all 24 treatments. To the right, on the right side of the blue line, is the climate for the most successful treatments, the top 5 treatments in terms of number of sagebrush established. To the right of that, what it says on x-axis, any Artemisia tridentata, we have those 16 plots which had at least some sagebrush present. And then the rightmost bars were those treatments that everybody agreed had no success. There was no sagebrush out in the landscape. And what we learned is surprisingly, actually, let me tell you first that this graph is showing just the climate differences of the seed sources. So looking at where the seeds come from. Is there more success when seeds are collected from a certain climate type? And these data suggest yes. There was a small effect of growing degree days, statistically significant, but functionally very marginal, so I'm not going to pay much attention to it. There's actually a more biologically significant effect of the mean temperature of the coldest month, where those treatments that had no success were getting their seeds from areas that had colder winter temperatures. Now, there's more, so the converse is that there was more seeding success when seeds were pulled from warmer sites. Now let's look at the climate differences amongst these different seeding projects, looking at specifically at the climate of the seeding site. Here again, we saw no effects of precipitation or drought, which really surprised me actually. Instead, we're seeing a signal of temperature and climate again. Those sites that were warmer had less or had no sagebrush emerging on them after many years. And again, the most successful treatments tended to be sites that have colder minimum temperatures and fewer degree days of growing. It's not too surprising to hear that. Other people have reported that warmer sites tend to have less sagebrush establishing on them, whether that sagebrush is naturally seeding itself or whether it's been seeded. These data are from Kevin Knudsen, Dave Pike, and others from the Chronosequence project around the whole Great Basin. Now, most importantly, I want to compare the climate of the seed source minus the seeding site. So looking on this axis right here, a value of 0 would indicate that in this case, the minimum temperature of the seed source matched the seeding site perfectly. And a more negative value would mean that the seed source was colder than the seeded site. You can see again no signal for mean annual precipitation precipitation or drought. Instead, we're seeing that minimum temperatures again are prevailing as an informative variable. Those treatments which had no sagebrush coming onto them after seeding tended to have a large climate transfer from the seed source to the seeded site. Seeds were getting moved from sites that were 3 degrees colder onto the seeded sites. The most surprising and interesting result here is in this bar, where you can see that the most successful seedings got their seeds from areas that had just about the same minimum winter temperatures. And this is corroborated and supported by ANOVA-type statistics as well as general estimating equations that take into account lots of factors. So that's climate. What about weather, post-fire seeding weather? I won't go through the same detail because it's a bit onerous. Instead, I just want to summarize what we found. And you won't be surprised to hear that cooler temperatures and more precipitation tend to favor the success of the seeding. And interestingly, it was the cooler temperatures and precipitation and weather that was occurring 3 to 4 years after seeding, not in the year just after seeding, that had the most effect. And this really surprised me. But as Stuart Hardigree mentioned yesterday, David Pilliod has discovered a very interesting pattern in which, if you look at this, the weather cycles that are associated with fires and post-fire seeding, it looks something like this. You have some relatively wet years in which fuels are grown up on the landscape, and those grasses and things like that are then going to increase fire hazards. When we enter a drought cycle, fire weather becomes more favorable, and fires are more likely to happen, and they happen. And those are usually drought years. What's interesting is that drought tends to persist in those first few years, first 1 or 2 years after the fire, when seedings are generally occurring. And interestingly, it's not until the 3rd or 4th year after a post-fire seeding in which weather becomes more favorable for seeding success. And very interestingly, the weather variables that can be used to predict seed success are in these subsequent years. Other variables, of course, were also important. We looked at the influence of pure live seed, not too much of an effect. We did find that that projects that had drill seeding of grasses along with the aerial seeding of sagebrush tended to be more successful. And we found that, as shown in this graph, that the pre-fire, pre-disturbance vegetation was really important. Here what you can see is that the abundance of sagebrush on these treatments was favorably improved if the site had sagebrush before the fire. And keep in mind that the sagebrush we detected after the seeding tended to be of different subspecies, so we're pretty sure that it wasn't that there was a residual seed bank of sagebrush or islands of sagebrush that survived the fire that were seeding a strong landscape. Instead, we think it's probably that these sagebrush before the fire create a matrix of suitable, favorable microsites in which we're seeing more sagebrush establishment after the fire. So all those factors were considered in our analysis. So let me just recap some of our main findings from this. We have identified some factors that can be considered to improve success. Sorry about the typo. Things like getting the climate right in our seed transfers. Often, subspecies are planted onto sites that are, I guess in some ways, not appropriate. Usually those are basin or mountain big sagebrush planted onto Wyoming big sagebrush sites, and that's not too surprising given the nature of seed production on these subspecies. And also hybrids are being introduced. Surprisingly, we didn't see an effect of these different subspecies on success of the treatments. Instead, we saw that population level variability, local adaptation to climate is particularly important, particularly with respect to minimum temperatures. Generally, we're seeing that seeds are being transferred from pretty cold places onto the Snake River Plain over the past few decades. And it's ironic that that seed transfer was occurring in the backdrop of a warming trend. So in the Snake River Plain, minimum temperatures have increased by several degrees over the last few decades when all these treatments were going in. And we're seeing that these cold adapted plant materials are favoring cool, wet weather for their establishment, which surprises me based on my other research, which suggests that minimum temperatures do provide a limitation to sagebrush establishment in our landscapes. So when the water is available in the Snake River Plain and other areas of sagebrush steppe, temperatures tend to be cool during the day, particularly during night. One prospect here is that by introducing sagebrush adapted to cold areas, we have sensitized our sagebrush landscapes, which can be tens of thousands of acres, and sensitize them to warm weather, which is problematic, again, considering that we are observing a warming climate. The other lines of evidence corroborate what I'm describing to you today. We've used these chambers to test the effects of minimum temperatures at very high elevations and relatively low elevations, like in the lower Snake River Plain. These chambers increase minimum temperatures by several degrees. We've observed no sagebrush responses of at least established adult sagebrush to these treatments in the Snake River Plain here. In contrast, at the very high elevations, we see large increases in growth, annual growth, in response to the warming. So the higher elevations are clearly under greater low temperature stress, and there's more selection for adaptation to minimum temperatures. And we're moving plant materials from here down to these locations where low temperatures appear to be much less of a constraint on the productivity of the sagebrush. Minimum temperatures and their importance are being recognized by the agencies. Just last year, seed zones, provisional seed zones that have, in this case, MWT stands for minimum winter temperature. So this is being considered in the selection of seeds, which I think is pretty exciting, and I'm looking forward to learning whether or not this improves the success of seedings. The assisted migration is kind of a buzzword in ecology now. The story that I've just described to you can be considered reverse assisted migration, I guess. It raises the question, if we had selected seeds from warmer areas than the Snake River Plain and planted them over the last 20 years, how would things have differed? And perhaps we should be thinking about that as we move forward into a warmer, drier climate in future years. Other problems are when we have megafires and there's no such thing as a local seed source because all the local sagebrush have been burned, and perhaps appropriate seed is not available. Should you plant whatever seed you can get for sagebrush, or should there be a mechanism to hold on to the funds and other resources to try seeding the subsequent year? That's a problematic question because sagebrush establishment is usually better when competing grasses have yet to establish. So that's not a trivial question. One thing I'm certain we could do that would help is to improve our ability to identify the host plants that were the seed source plants, as well as the seeds that are provided to the seed warehouses and given to the field offices. This is an area I think is a low-hanging fruit for improving the situation. And as the secretarial order regarding sagebrush and restoration of sagebrush ecosystem now appreciates, providing agencies more time and flexibility to deal with seeding these disturbed, Wyoming big sagebrush sites will undoubtedly help. Seed zones, prescribing select criteria for seed sources is not free. It imposes more resource demands and constraints. Here's the provisional seed zones that were on the WWETCAC website last year. They have very narrow increments of temperature in many different seed zones. The big question is, how resolute do we need to be in our seed zone divisions in order to get seed zones right? This is a major pending question that I think could be resolved sooner rather than later. We're trying to get at this additional information need with the Common Gardens, as well as with a follow-up study to the Boise Pilot. It's titled the Sage Success Project. We're adding sites across the Great Basin to look at some of the same questions I've tried to address today. We're also adding in known successes identified by the BLM. We have 35 such treatments, primarily in the Winnemucca and Jarvidge districts, in which we're going to compare these successful sites against less successful sites. We're making measurements, again, at the plot and the landscape scale. At the landscape scale, the important feature is that we're increasing our focus on those little pockets of sagebrush that emerge, the little islands that may emerge in larger treatment areas. And those little islands can be very important seed sources in future years. With Colin Homer and colleagues, we're using some of the new remote sensing tools that can help detect sagebrush and monitor emergency stabilization seeding outcomes over the vast areas, the many thousands of acres with which they occur. And this is pretty exciting research that I think we've got going on right now. But here, just to recap the challenges with big sagebrush. It's diverse, and that's both an opportunity but a problem. It's a problem because identifying the subspecies is not easy, and there is no map yet, surprisingly, of where these different subspecies and cytotypes occur. That's somewhat frustrating considering that other widespread desert shrubs like creosote bush are mapped. We know where the different cytotypes occur. Even blackbrush has a better map of where its different ecotypes occur compared to big sagebrush. And out of fairness, big sagebrush, its biogeography is a lot more complex than these other species. We've learned from the Sage Success Project, however, that given the criteria that the BLM and we have been using to identify sagebrush, the majority of plants in the landscape actually don't fit into one of the subspecies categories very well, and we're not sure how to deal with that yet. Just the whole concept of subspecies within big sagebrush is not trivial. So more work needs to be done on that. And considering that seed banks are so short-lived and these fires are likely to occur in the landscape, large seed transfers are still likely to occur in the future. We need to continue working on these problems to provide the land managers the guidance needed to deal with the problem. And I just want to finish with one last point here. These are two modeled projections, two images of sagebrush distributions in the future. Both predict some contraction of big sagebrush under future climates in red, as well as some expansion shown here in blue. I think it's remarkable that we're using these maps, yet we don't even have a map of where the different subspecies are growing. The other thing that's really intriguing is that we're probably influencing how these future changes in sagebrush may occur by moving the different subspecies and differently adapted populations around in the landscape. So I hope that I've demonstrated that the problem is important, that there's challenges, but also opportunities to deal with. And with that, I'll close and open up for questions.
Great, thanks, Matt. So if you have any questions, please type them into your questions pane in your control panel. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, Matt, do you know, so you said that the subspecies haven't even been mapped yet. Is anyone working on that?
Not to my knowledge. Bryce and I have been cobbling together observations of sagebrush across the whole Great Basin, and that can be used to get a very preliminary test of whether or not there's certain habitat affinities we can use to begin taking the land fire coverage of where sagebrush is and attributing it for subspecies. In other words, taking the polygons where sagebrush is known to occur in the landscape and attributing them by subspecies. It's going to have to be a modeled exercise, I think, rather than a direct mapping effort, if that makes sense. We've proposed to the USGS that a project to map subspecies be funded, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, good luck. That would be great. Yeah, and then one more question. So you were talking about David Pilliard's latest research, and it's actually showing that subsequent years, not the immediate year after seeding, is more important, or the weather is more important in subsequent years after seeding?
Yeah, it's that the seedings have by and large tended to occur in dry years, and that's dictated by the programmatic policy or ESR program. They're emergency post-fire seedings, so they're supposed to go in right away. And because it's drought conditions that led to the fire, and drought tends to occur not just in one year, but multiple years, we're seeing that that the weather that can stimulate germination and good establishment, in general, is not occurring until about the third or fourth year after the seeding.
Interesting.
Yeah, the compelling thing about that is that it's really important to have a long-term perspective on the seeding effort.
Right. Yeah, so would the management implication be don't always seed immediately after a fire?
Well, if you're that certain that drought is continuing to affect your seeding site, that could be a consideration. The risk, of course, is that competition from undesirable plants will only increase the longer you wait to put the seed down.
Right.
I think the bigger, more feasible or realistic implication is that the land manager should be given the resources, the time and flexibility to do multiple seedings. So perhaps apply some of the resources for that first post-fire year, but save some of the resources and be allowed to use them 2, 3, 4, or sometimes even 10 years down the road.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Thanks. Well, we don't have any questions. So, yeah, thank you very much for participating. We'd greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey of this webinar that will appear after the webinar has ended. A link to the recording of this webinar on the Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. And our final webinar in this series for the season, titled Seed Zones and Climate Change, presented by Francis Kilkenny, will take place on May 20th. If you have more questions regarding this webinar or have requests for future webinars, please email or call me anytime. And Matt has also provided his email address, so that's great. So thank you all for your participation today, and thank you so much, Matt, for your presentation.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, have a great day.